When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. While there are so many geographic locations that are associated with one U.S. president, it's not as common to find places outside of Washington, D.C. that have multiple intersections with presidential history. However, the Queen City of the Lakes is one of those places. Hello, and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry, and I'm joined in this episode by a special guest, John Fagant of the Buffalo Presidential Center, to discuss the work of the center in educating folks on the role that Buffalo has played in presidential history. John is on the board of trustees of the Buffalo Presidential Center, an all-volunteer nonprofit organization chartered by New York State, whose mission is to encourage the study, exploration, interpretation, and public awareness of Western New York's contributions to both the presidency and national affairs. Once you're done with this episode, to find out more, you can find a link to the Buffalo Presidential Center on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. With two presidents who lived in Buffalo, one that was assassinated there, and a destination visited by nearly every sitting president for the last 140 years, starting with James Monroe, you can imagine that we had much to discuss. Thus, without any further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my conversation with John.
Are you feeling more fulfilled now that you're back to work?
No. I need a vacation.
See the movie that critics are saying is an awesome,
Look at that.
crowd-pleasing, fist-pumping, all-out brawl of a film.
You're right about that.
They're coming after our family. Go fix this.
Oh, my.
Nobody 2, rated R, only in theaters now.
John, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Well, pleasure to be here.
So, to get us started, would you mind sharing with our listeners a little bit about the Buffalo Presidential Center, how it was founded, and the work of the center?
Absolutely. Yes, it actually has a long history, which I'll put in a very short terms. But it started a few decades ago when two women, one a Buffalo lawyer, Mary Ann Sacramento Friedman, and another a county legislature, Joan Bozer. They were friends, and they were just at lunch, and they were discussing the presidential history here and how no one, including the area, knows about it. So they went out and found some collectors, a couple of collectors, one of them which is Bren Price. Bren is still with the group. Mary Ann and Joan have passed away within the past 10 years. But by 2010, they had something going on, and they were able to view some artifacts at different places. But it took until 2020 till they were able to get a permanent museum space. And that space is in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. They rent out a room on the second floor. And ironically, they opened it. Erie County executive opened it one day, and then he went out to the main area and closed it because COVID was there. So it was only open for a few minutes on its first day. But I became involved a couple of years ago. I'd given a talk there, and afterwards, Bren Price had asked me to get involved in it. And I love it. It's the 2 years I've been in there. The idea behind it is to bring forth knowledge to the community about what we have here historically, as far as the presidents go, and also nationally. And we have programs. This year we had a unique program. One of the new board members is in the school system, and he put together a presidential Jeopardy game. And he went to the schools and got 9 students out of it. And they came and they went against one of our board members, and he had the whole thing set up on the board. It was quite impressive, presidential pets, blah, 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 the whole Jeopardy game. And it was, we're going to continue that as a way to connect with the young ones, the parents. So, as each student signed up, they were given cards, presidential cards. And on the back of the cards, there were facts about each president. And they were told that the game, Jeopardy, is going to have those facts on there. And the parents said they studied like crazy for 2 weeks before time. And when that game did come about, they did beat our local guy, and much to everybody's applause. So, so it's a growing feature, and we're now going a little bit beyond just the presidency. It's also those locally that were involved, whether like William Miller. He was vice presidential candidate with Goldwater, but he was from this area. His daughters came up here last year to give a talk. And then we had a Jack Kemp Day. He played with the Bills and then went to Congress. And Shirley Chisholm, even her, even though she's from New York City, she eventually married a Buffalo guy, and she's buried in a Buffalo cemetery. So we're trying to expand even beyond just the presidents themselves.
I love that. And especially speaking for the Presidency's podcast, that's one of the things that I try and emphasize with my podcast. It's not just about the people who served as president, but all the people around them, the people who were influencers at the time, who, had an impact. And so I love that y'all are expanding how you're approaching things as well.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we have our own special presidents that we focus on, but in general, we're trying to focus on any president that visited the area.
Absolutely.
Of which most of them did, except for a few of the early guys, like Washington or Adams or Jefferson. We're not sure about Rutherford B. Hayes yet. And I was thinking of going to his house this year. It's in Ohio. It's about a 5-hour drive. So I may go there, see what they know about it. But anyways, other than that, pretty much from Lincoln on, they've been here.
Well, and as we briefly touched on when we started to talk about this interview, like you said, Buffalo has a great number of presidential connections, starting with someone that we're going to get to before too long on the podcast, and that's James Monroe. So his visit as part of his national tour in 1817.
That's correct.
John, what led Monroe to travel to Buffalo, and how did that visit go?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to tell you, it was actually William Henry Harrison's the first to come to the area, but not as president. He came during the War of 1812. But Monroe was the first sitting president to come here. And he came as part of his, as you said, his 1817 tour of the states. And his tour of the state, he had been inaugurated in March of 1817, and by June he had this plan. So he actually traveled from July through September, maybe even into October. I'm not sure. But his idea was to check the military defenses around the northern states, the New England states, and then the ones off of Canada. As you well know, the War of 1812 had just ended 2 or 3 years earlier. Much of the conflict had been on the Canadian-U.S. border. So that was part of his idea of going around. The other thing was to get national unity back together, because during the war, the New Englanders were considering secession. They were not in favor of the War of 1812. And so he was trying to bring that back together. So those two issues took him to quite a few places. Now, he did come to the Niagara region in August. He came from Sackett's Harbor and then went across Lake Ontario to Fort Niagara. And Fort Niagara, of course, had been involved in the War of 1812. And and then he went to Niagara Falls. He came down there, and actually his Buffalo stop wasn't really that impressive. He was here for about 2-3 hours, essentially. And I don't believe he even stayed overnight here. I think he stayed overnight in Black Rock with Porter, Peter Porter, maybe. Anyways, so he came to Buffalo. He was, this talk and all that, and then he caught the a schooner on Lake Erie, and took a 3-day outing. He went to Detroit next. So he was here, but it wasn't as significant as his other stops. I think he was more interested. Buffalo at that point, it was burned down during the war. And even when it was burned down, it was only a frontier settlement, so they were just rebuilding. There wasn't a lot. This was prior to the Erie Canal coming in and prior to its growth. So I think Monroe was more interested in Fort Niagara, which is at the other end of the Niagara River. Buffalo's at one end, and to set it up there. But it was a simple visit, but it was significant in our sense of, yes, it's the first president to come through. And who would have thought that in 1817 when travel's so difficult? So, but Monroe went all over. It's impressive how he traveled. I'll have to listen to your podcast when you talk about him. I think that was a very extensive tour, 3-4 months.
Absolutely. And he actually did multiple, and it's interesting because this was something that Washington did as well. And we hadn't really had a president since Washington do these national tours. But like Washington, he kind of split it up. So he went north, he went to the west, he went south. But it sounds like Buffalo came out a little better than Charlotte did. So I'm from the Charlotte area. When Washington came through, of course, he kept a diary of his travels, and Charlotte was described as trifling. So hopefully Monroe thought better about Buffalo than Washington thought of Charlotte.
Points, they're all frontier settlements, it seems like. They're just nothing places. There's a few people here, a grog shop, maybe the people come and go. So, yeah, I'm sure Charlotte has a similar frontier settlement history, which in itself is fascinating when you look at it. How it grew from nothing to 10 people living there to 100. It's a fascinating history, I think, of any city, how it grows.
Absolutely. Well, and going with this idea of presidential connections and Buffalo's connections to presidential history. So at this time that Monroe was making this trip, there was a 17-year-old in Western New York who hadn't found his way to Buffalo just yet, but would ultimately become a prominent figure in the Queen City of the Lakes. And it was funny when I was looking up Buffalo's nickname, because Charlotte is also the Queen City. So I was like, Queen City of the Lakes. All right.
So is Cincinnati.
Yes.
They're a Queen City too. I gave a talk last week, and somebody asked me, why'd you name it the Queen City? Because that was the title of my talk. I said, it was, they gave it that. But I did mention, Cincinnati was also called a Queen City. So I didn't know that about Charlotte. So I'll have to include that going forward.
I love it.
How many Queen Cities are there out there?
I found 3 thus far. So
there's a lot. Yeah, we all think we're unique in that way. The Queen City.
The Queen City.
Anyways, yeah.
So the 17-year-old,
Yes.
in Western New York. So, John, what can you share with us about Millard Fillmore's early life and how he got started in politics?
Yes. Fillmore was born in the upstate area, which is now the Finger Lakes region. And back when he was born there, Cayuga County, it was wilderness. His closest neighbors were 2 miles away. So even he said in his short autobiography, he grew up in the woods or in the forest. And by the time he was 14, he was apprenticed out to a shop, and it didn't work out, and he came back. His father was a failing farmer. He didn't want his kids to be farmers. So his father was able to get him, this is when he was 19, I think, he was able to get him as an internship into a law office, so he could start that career. But even before that, let me say this: when he was a carter, I think a wool carter, I think that where they separate the wool, and even at 17, he knew he was uneducated, so he bought a dictionary and he took it to work with him. And whenever he had a break at work, he would look up a new word, and that was his one way of trying to become educated. And by 19, similar to Lincoln and these log cabin guys, he's one of the log cabin presidents. I think there's a few of them: Garfield, Lincoln, a couple others. So Fillmore's one of them. And he did move to East Aurora, which is a suburb of Buffalo, about 15 miles away from the city. And he moved there in the 1820s. His house is there now. He built the house in 1826. Supposedly, it's the only presidential house still existing that a president actually built. He and his dad built it. But his early life included becoming a teacher and becoming a lawyer. He became a lawyer in East Aurora. And as he said, when he became confident enough, he moved into Buffalo, which was, by that point, a larger city.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting, this idea of, as we were talking about, cities growing, and the fact that he was kind of growing along with the city. That's interesting.
The city, Buffalo, became officially a city in 1832, and Fillmore was part of writing the charter for the city. So he, at that point, he was a politician at that point. He had become, in East Aurora, the anti-Masons had taken form. William Morgan was the Mason who threatened to out the Mason secrets. And he was living in Batavia, which is about 10 miles from my house, 20 from the city. And Morgan disappears, never to be seen again, and it's a big uproar, and the anti-Mason group forms. So that's how Fillmore became involved. And he became involved this is the late 1820s, early 1830s. And at that point, he met Thurlow Weed, who was also rising, and along with William Seward. And the three of them were together in the beginning. They later become bitter rivals. But in the beginning, Weed is helping both of them to slot into political areas. So, Fillmore in the 30s, he does get elected to Congress. He's in Congress from 1832 to 42, maybe, with missing a couple of years. And in 1840, when William Henry Harrison was elected, the Whigs had gained the House, not only the presidency, but the House. Fillmore came in second in the voting for the Speaker of the House. And as such, he was then given the House Ways and Means Committee. So he was the head of that for 2 years. He was he essentially wrote the tariff of 1842. And so he was well known within the Whig community. And he served with John Quincy Adams. He at this point in time, he's definitely, he always was anti-slavery, but later on the issues come up, in his presidency. But he voted with John Quincy Adams against the gag rule through the 1830s. And so he was looked upon by others as anti-slavery at that point in time, up to the early 40s.
Well, and it's interesting because this is such a time of transition and change and flux, and you've got new political parties being formed, you've got issues coming up, there's just so much contention. And so I was wondering, what does Fillmore's unexpected nomination as vice president on the Whig ticket in 1848 tell us about the political landscape of the time, and what role did he play in supporting the Whig campaign effort in that year?
He retired from Congress in 42. 44, he made a big effort to get on the ticket as the vice president. That was Henry Clay. and Fillmore was outmaneuvered in that respect. I don't know, Theodore Freilichhuysen, or I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. Do you know how to pronounce it?
That's about as good as you could do.
I've never heard it pronounced. I've seen it in writing, but anyway, so Fillmore lost out there. He was actively pursuing the vice presidency in 44. So from there, he went to the state, and in 47, he's elected to U.S. state comptroller. So 48 comes around, and as you said, it's very chaotic at that point. Of course, the Mexican War, the annexation of Texas, the Wilmot Proviso, all these things are setting things off. It's sectionalizing the parties. But Fillmore was not actively looking for the vice presidency then. But the Whigs put out Zachary Taylor, a Louisiana slaveholder, and this upset the Northerners. And you've got the threat of the Free Soil Party already there that's grabbed many of the Democrats from the barn burners from New York State. And they did grab certain anti-slavery Whigs. So they didn't want to lose any more Whigs to the Free Soil. So Fillmore's friend, unbeknownst to Fillmore, rushed the stage during the chaos after Taylor was nominated. And he said, he wants to nominate Millard Fillmore as someone who can balance this ticket. And by doing that, I mean, at this point, he's already broken from Weed and Seward in the state. So the Whig Party in New York State has its own conflicts. Weed wanted Seward to either be president, VP, or senator. So when Collier jumps in there and gets Fillmore, he gives a great talk and he convinces everybody, and Fillmore gets nominated, I think, on the second vote. So yeah, it's obscure, yet it's not. Fillmore was well known to the Whig community. He happened to be in the state comptrollers for that, but he had been in Congress for many years, so he was well known. But yeah, it was a surprise to him, and yeah, he took it. And how did he do it? Well, he was the Whig all out. He pushed it. He had to defend because the South didn't like him on a ticket. The North didn't like Taylor on the ticket, as far as the Whigs go. So they both they're defending each other, and Fillmore did have a few anti-slavery activities that were not conducive to Southern voting. So he had to clean that up, or to get there. I'll tell you two things. Let me tell you I was going to save it for later, but let me throw it in now. Two things that really hit him was in 1842, Fillmore actually helped two fugitive slaves in their escape. And I have sources for the one. In October 1842, a man named Milton Clark had escaped from Ohio. And Fillmore, George Johnson was Fillmore's friend, but he was a Liberty Party man. And he brought him to Fillmore, and he told Fillmore a story, and Fillmore gave him money and helped out. And even Clark, a few years later, after Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Law, Clark in a newspaper wrote that, yeah, this man helped me, and if he helped me today, it would be against the law. This is in 1851. Yeah. But anyways, so he helped a couple of them, and that's what he was trying to get to the South to say, okay, we're all doing that, but let's, balance the ticket here. So anyways, they did win, as you know. Taylor won. They beat Cass, who was not a popular Democrat individual. And then, of course, the Free Soilers had Martin Van Buren on there, and that was driven by the barn burner Democrats, which really helped the Whig cause for winning. So he did get the vice presidency, and he did get elected in 1848 during a tumultuous time.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned the Fugitive Slave Law, and of course that's part of the Compromise of 1850.
Yes.
So, as those who have read ahead know, Fillmore was presiding over months of contentious debating in the Senate as part of his duties as vice president when President Zachary Taylor passed away unexpectedly.
Yes.
And so when Fillmore became the 13th U.S. president, what role did he play in what would come to be known as the Compromise of 1850? And what insight did his prior tenure as presiding officer of the Senate give him in terms of the various issues being debated?
As vice president, he was president of the Senate, and he was there for many of the famous talks. I mean, it's the Senate at its glory with Daniel Webster's March of 7th speech, Henry Clay, John Calhoun giving his last talk. You have William Seward giving his talk. So he's very familiar with the arguments going pro-compromise, anti-compromise. And Fillmore's view on that went against Zachary Taylor, the president's view. And a few weeks before Taylor passed away, Fillmore, who was not in the good graces of Taylor had gone to William Seward and Thurlow Weed, which upset Fillmore because they were getting the New York State participation. What's the word I'm looking for? The jobs. They were getting the jobs. And Fillmore finally went to him. I think Taylor just didn't have an idea that states could have conflicts like that within the party. So I'm not blaming him at all. But Fillmore finally went to him and said, "Look, I need to. My guys are not getting the jobs, and everybody's mad at me." And so, anyways, he did tell Taylor at that point. He said, "Look, if the vote comes down to where I have to vote," he says, "I'm voting for compromise." And Taylor was, he was fighting the compromise as he wanted to bring in, I think he wanted to bring in New Mexico as a free state, which everybody knew California was going to come in that way. But, so anyways, Fillmore told him that. And then, of course, a few weeks later, Taylor passes away. So in a way, Fillmore is ready for that moment. And he immediately, well, it's July that he becomes president. And during the month of July, he does let Congress know that you put out legislation that is constitutional and legal, and I will sign it. Let's get this crisis over with. He had twofold reasons as president. One was to save the Union. The other was to save the Whig Party. He did one out of two. But the save the Union, of course, that's and he immediately Congress wanted to bring California in first, and Fillmore said no. The question here, the crisis here is the Texas-New Mexico border. That's where Texas was threatening to send in troops. Zachary Taylor was threatening to send in federal troops against the Texans. And when Fillmore got there, he said, "We got to resolve this one first." And even then, Fillmore said he would send in federal troops also. Texas has to leave New Mexico alone. And we need to, and they did. They fixed, they paid off the debt, Texas debt. Texas called away from, they were claiming land up to the Rio Grande, up to Albuquerque, Santa Fe area. So they resolved that one first. So he signs that. Then California state bill comes in. He signs that, and all of them come in within 2 months. He has signed all the bills, and the only one out of them that he took any time out was the fugitive slave law. He took 3 days before he signed that one. He knew it would kill him. One, he wasn't big on it, and it was a repressive law, but he felt at the time, whether true or not, he felt at the time that if he didn't sign it, there was a good chance of secession movement. There was a good chance of possible civil war happening. And historians have gone back and forth on that. Was it real or not? Well, it doesn't matter if it's real or not. That's what they thought. And that's what he thought. So he signed the bill. Well, first he gave it to his attorney general, Crittenden, and he said, "Is this bill constitutional?" And Crittenden came back a couple of days later and said, "Yes." No surprise there. Crittenden was a slave owner. Yeah, okay. So, I would love to have heard had the attorney general been a northern non-slaveholder, but nonetheless. So Fillmore, being a Whig, their idea of the presidency is Congress makes the laws, presidents execute them. And they were not into vetoing. unless it was unconstitutional. That's why they formed against Andrew Jackson, who was vetoing out of personal reasons. So their idea of the presidency was different. And Fillmore was a classic Whig. And so he signed the fugitive slave law. And he knew right then and there, he said he knew he's killing himself in the North. And
Yeah.
but he said he felt he was doing it for the best of the country. So, and he, even around here, I mean, he's conflicted. Our views are conflicted on him. I mean, there's some on the board that despise him. And there's others that are, understanding of, well, what would you have done? What would the president have done? If he hadn't signed it, what would have happened? Yeah. You look at the compromise, although both sides were angry at the compromise, the North got something out of it. They got a free state in California. They got no slavery in New Mexico or Utah, and Utah was becoming Mormon. They weren't going to go slavery. They got in D.C. area, they have the slave trade eliminated. And the fugitive slave law was really all that was absolutely given to the South. So, it destroyed Fillmore in the North as far as going forward.
Well, and it's interesting, this idea of the presidential veto being just about vetoing something that is seen as unconstitutional. And, even going back to John Adams's presidency, Adams is criticized for signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, but he too had this idea that you can't veto something unless it's unconstitutional, and he didn't see those as unconstitutional. And so, but just like Fillmore, he's criticized for that.
And that was the general thought early on with the presidents, all the way up until Jackson came along.
Yeah.
And he expanded the process of what a president can do. And the first 6 presidents had very few vetoes. I think didn't Jackson have more vetoes than all of them?
Yeah.
I believe. And Fillmore was in that camp. Of course, with the Whigs, that was their thought. And the Whigs, when you look at, the Whigs had 4 presidents, but only one really.
Yeah.
Harrison died early. Tyler was really a Democrat. He was a Whig because he hated Jackson. And then Zachary Taylor was a general. Nobody knew what he was. But surprisingly, after he did become pro-Northern, and his views were, Seward and Weed had grabbed him, and he had upset the South. But Fillmore was the only one that had gone through the whole Whig process from the 1830s. So if you look at the history of the country and you want to look at a Whig presidency, he's the one you look at. He's the one you look at and say, well, did he follow Whig policy? Did he go forward in that direction? It's an interesting take on it anyways.
Well, and that kind of gets to my next question, because given that Fillmore is a president that is lesser known to the general public, beyond the Compromise of 1850, what would you say is the most important thing for folks to know about Fillmore's 969 days in office as chief executive?
969, very good.
Counting every day.
He's one of 6 that served for less than 1,000 days. And that's a great trivia question, by the way. Yes, his foreign policy, it was he was there 2.5 years? Yeah, 2.5 years. So, with Peru and with Portugal, he fixed things. Peru was interesting because his Secretary of State Webster had written an aggressive memo to Peru because the U.S. wanted the guano that was in Peru's island of Lobos, and there was controversy who owned the island. Peru said they owned it. Well, Fillmore took that and settled it down a little bit and said, no, we're going to respect the sovereignty of Peru. And by doing that, Peru was open to negotiation, to having U.S. ships come in. Fillmore did not want to get aggressive. Of course, he was against the aggressiveness of Polk, as all the Whigs were, or at least the Northern Whigs were, in the even the Southern and the Mexican War and the annexations. They were more they were less for annexation and more for, commerce and growth that way. But yeah, so he handled that well, respecting the rights of another country. And he did that with Portugal also, which was a tiny country. They owed the U.S. money from the War of 1812. He negotiated a peace there. He also is the one that put Commodore Perry to the seas to go to Japan, to open up Japan for commerce. Fillmore was all about commerce. He didn't care about he wasn't about war. But the one thing he did do to the north, he did start enforcing the fugitive slave law. But he balanced that, and this isn't as well known, he balanced that with forcing the South to follow the laws concerning filibustering. And they're filibustering, especially with Cuba. And they had there was a private citizen named Lopez that was trying to get a war with Cuba going so that the U.S. could claim Cuba and make it a slave state. So Fillmore, in that regard, was against it. And he challenged South Carolina. He said, I will send troops down there if you guys don't stop this. We're not going to take Cuba. We're not going to do it. So he tried to harmonize the two areas by saying, yeah, okay, I'm enforcing a fugitive slave law, but in the South, I'm enforcing this filibustering, which is going on. So I hope you guys see it. And of course, neither side saw it. But nonetheless, it was there. So, 2.5 years, that was about, much of what he had going on.
Yeah, well, and as you kind of alluded to, though he and his supporters tried, Fillmore was unable to secure his party's nomination in 1852 for a full term as president. So, John, what led him to be passed over by the Whigs at their convention that year? And what legacy would you say that Fillmore left at the end of his short tenure of office?
Fillmore, when he came to office in December 1850, 6 months later, he had told his cabinet he did not want re-election. And he had told privately throughout the 2 years, don't put me up for re-election. But the cabinet was saying, we can't announce this publicly because we need your name out there. First, if you announce it too early, no one's going to take you seriously. They're just going to look for the next president. So we have to have you here. So Fillmore never announced it publicly, even though that was his draw. Now, Daniel Webster knew that, and he was Secretary of State, and Webster, of course, was passionate to have the presidency, almost to a point of destroying the Whig Party, and he was trying to get a unity party together to get his own presidency going. Webster had no chance. But when 52 came around, Fillmore reluctantly said, okay, I'm not going to say anything. Let's just see what happens. And they went to the convention. Of course, Thurlow Weed and William Seward, bitter enemies with Fillmore by this time. They were pushing Winfield Scott. Scott was not palatable to the South. Fillmore was not palatable to the North. Webster was not palatable to anybody. But the three of them were in the votes. And in the first vote, Fillmore actually came out on top. He had something like 133. Scott had 130, and then Webster had 28, I think. Now, the Webster-Fillmore thing, they were supposed to work together. One of them was supposed to ease off and give the other one the votes. And, if Webster had realized what was going on, his 28 votes would have put Fillmore over the top. But he never backed down. Webster wanted Fillmore's votes. But the Fillmore people said, you're not going to get all the votes. If we give Fillmore votes away, a lot of them are going to Scott. But the Webster votes would have gone to Fillmore. So in the end, Webster and Fillmore, neither one get it. And Scott won on the 53rd ballot. Now, that's a lot of ballots. So, Fillmore was in it to the end. What was his... how did they look upon him immediately after his presidency? I think was very positive because the economy was going very well at that point. The crisis of secession and, the the territories was calmed down for the moment. The issue was really just the fugitive slave law, and that was being enforced somewhat, and it was starting to, in general, I think, Fillmore was looked upon well at the end of his time. So there was fear about Taylor, had he not passed away, that this thing could have gone into a war at 1850, because he was very much under Seward's influence, which was non-compromising. We're not going to give the South anything. And Fillmore's personality and such was, he wanted to keep the nation together. Now, in the process of all this, of course, the Whig Party fell apart, and it was due to Fillmore. I don't know. Webster had a lot to do with it. He was with his unit party. Whigs in the South were starting to go to the Democrat Party because they were becoming sectional by that point. By 1848, instead of Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, you're getting, the Northern free soilers and Southern slaveholding issues. So it's becoming sectional, and it explains why Fillmore later went into the American Know Nothing Party, because he felt it was a national party. I can't say much for his political astuteness there, but it was still, that was the reason. It wasn't, he was not anti-Catholic. In fact, much of what he did, I think one of your questions will take care of that later. He did get to the Catholic churches around here, and he was more pro-immigrant than many would think. But anyways.
Well, and that's a perfect segue, because, Fillmore ultimately had just over 20 years in his post-presidency. What did he do once he returned home to Buffalo, and what impact did he have on the city that was his home for a majority of his life?
Immediately after his presidency, well, first, his wife died a month after his presidency. She got sick at the Pierce inauguration. So when he left, he came home not to Buffalo for joy, but he came home with a casket. And from there, he traveled across the United States for a while and then went to Europe. I believe he was the first president to go to Europe. I may be wrong on that. I'm not sure. But anyways, when he finally did settle back in Buffalo, he remarried, and he felt Buffalo was his home at that point. And he had essentially, even before his presidency, he did a lot for the community. He was active in the Young Men's Association, which is the precursor to the library system. He was in the 1850s. He was very effective in forming the first general hospital here. And going forward, he was involved in the formation of the University of Buffalo, which at first was a medical school. And he was also involved in the Fine Arts Society, which later became the Art Center here at the Buffalo Art Gallery. He put money into and was the first president of the Buffalo Historical Society. And even in 1867, he gave money to the SPCA. And he said, we have to help those little fellows out. And it was the second SPCA to be formed in the country. And then later in life, he became an honorary member of the Young Women's Christian Association. So he had quite an effect on the area. Our two presidents, Fillmore and Cleveland, Fillmore did much more. He gave much back to the community. He even lived back here, despite when he came back, he went back to his old church, the Unitarian Church, and many in there decided not to go to church anymore because he had signed the fugitive slave law. But he was humbled by it all. But because of his works that he's done here, he has a name, Fillmore Avenue, Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital. He used to have a college named after him, Millard Fillmore College, which was the University of Buffalo nighttime school, but that's now another name. So, as I said, it's he loved his area here, and he died here and he's buried here. But he left a controversial background, mainly because of the fugitive slave law, and it became an issue. Of course, as you know, of course, it was part of the original Constitution. 1787 had a fugitive slave law, and then in 1793 they passed another fugitive slave law. So it wasn't as though he passed the law out of nowhere. It was just the more reprehensible version of what was out there. But it brings up the question. What does one do? Can one do what's good for the country and make a poor moral decision on it and still be good for the country? I don't know. It brings up a lot of questions. One of the reasons why I think Fillmore's important to look at is that, the whole antebellum period, you have conflicted opinions by many. You might look at it as hypocritical opinions, but my view is we're all hypocritical at some point. And to study his presidency is to look at someone who truly hated slavery, didn't know how to get rid of it. And of course, none of the politicians did, other than through colonization, which was never going to happen. And, how do we judge this person? We shouldn't judge them, but we're humans, so we're going to judge. We do that. And he brings up a lot of interesting issues, pro and con. By all accounts, he was a good man, a good husband, good father, but yet he signed a fugitive slave law. By all accounts, he helped a couple of slaves actually get through the region, yet he signed the law. You always go back to that yet he signed the law, and he did good for it. And there's even some, that he had given to the Catholic Church nearby, and he gave to anyone essentially that asked, including even though the African-American community in Buffalo was very small, it was only maybe 700 or so at a time when the city was 80,000, 100,000. But he also gave to them when they needed. So he was not, what they say, no guile, they said. I heard a few quotes on that, no guile. He didn't really have the hatred. Although with weed, he was close. He tried hard to get back with weed, but Thurlow Weed kept on bumping him. He had chosen Seward by that point. And I'm not slamming those guys either, because I think Seward's a fascinating character. But anyways.
John, I think you make the case of why, we have these folks who are lumped into this category of the forgotten presidents, but I think you make a wonderful case of why Fillmore is worthy of more study. There's so much to him, there's so much complexity, and that's ultimately in this time of increasing chaos, of increasing complexities of the issues and the debates, and trying to figure out what to do about this can that's been kicked down the road generation upon generation of what to do about slavery. You have Fillmore, and for better or worse, he tried to answer that. And it is something that we do have to study, and it tells us so much. I think it helps us to reflect on the questions of our day. What are we doing about them, and how are we navigating difficult waters?
The another point there, why study Fillmore? You can make a case that he came into the presidency during one of the most contentious periods. And, off the top of my head, you can think of Lincoln coming in, or maybe FDR in the Depression. In both those cases, they had 4 months to prepare. Fillmore, as a vice president, had 1 day. And I don't know if it's truly appreciated, the crisis that was going on at that point. I remember giving a talk a long time ago about the Compromise of 1850, and I heard one woman on the front row say, "I didn't know there was compromise." So the history is not that well known. Fillmore did come into a highly controversial period, and one author, David Potter, I read him many years ago. I think he wrote in the 70s. He said something about, it's amazing that Fillmore is not appreciated. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's amazing that people don't appreciate how quickly he resolved the conflict that was going on for 4 years. He did it within 2 months, for better or for worse. But it did gain time, to, and that's all Congress and politicians were doing at that time, was trying to gain time. Let's pass it on, like you said. Even today, no one wants to deal with an issue. We want to pass it on, and it takes it takes guts to actually deal with the issue. Now, he didn't deal with every issue. For instance, New Mexico wanted to come in as a free state, but they sent the Constitution to Fillmore, and he just buried it. He never presented it to Congress. He thought it would be too controversial. Let's keep the peace. So, I for 2.5 years as president, I think he's in one of the most controversial periods. He, Taylor, Tyler, Polk, all those guys that, the average person doesn't necessarily know. They're well aware. And of course, you have Pearson Buchanan afterwards. That a lot of the unknown presidents were right there in the middle of major crisis.
Yeah.
Which makes it's, I think, fun to study.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you, after reading the Warren Harding book, it was written by John Dean, from Watergate. He loved Harding. So, and it made me look at Harding differently. I said, I have to go looking more about him. I don't know. And then the Chester Arthur thing, these presidents that only served short terms, or in Arthur's case, he served almost the whole term. But, maybe we need to look at these guys, and maybe they weren't all bad or obscure. When they say Fillmore was an obscure president, he wasn't at the time. He was well known. The country knew him. He's obscure only later. 100 years later, he's obscure. So, it's good. And this other, you probably read it, Robert Rabeck's biography on Fillmore, 1959.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I love his opening where he says he thought he was getting a pompous president here, and it turns out he was shocked to find this was a high character man he was doing. But I lost my train of thought.
Oh, no worries. It sometimes happens when we're talking presidents.
I had a talk last week, and I lost my train of thought, and the whole crowd just looked at each other. I said, I don't have it. I lost it. It's gone.
No worries.
I had a great point to make. It was an excellent point I was going to make. I don't know what it was, but something about Rabeck. Rabeck said something nice about him.
Well, and as we wrap up our conversation, I just wanted to ask you, and it comes across, you have a personal passion for presidential history. So I wanted to see, John, what got you interested in studying the U.S. presidents? And is there any point in presidential history that is currently a big focus of your personal study or reading?
When I was 5 years old in kindergarten, I don't know how, but I had president cards, like baseball cards, football cards. I loved them. I learned every president when I was 5 years old. Back then, it was Eisenhower. Well, Kennedy had just been elected, but he didn't have a card yet. So in kindergarten, I had to tell all the kids the presidents. Of course, they weren't interested, but the teacher was interested. A year later, I got to see President Kennedy in person when he came to town. He was only a few feet away from me. I was in awe, and I've been a political junkie, I guess, presidential junkie, not necessarily current events thing, but in the 60s, I grew up. My dad was always watching the news and such, so I would watch with him. So it's been there forever, since 5 years old, anyways. And my area of interest now has, I guess, like everybody, I guess it started with the Civil War, but then more of my interest is in pre-Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if I go worldwide, it's pre-World War II. I like to hear what builds up to it. So in American history, it's the antebellum period, the anti-slavery movements, the presidencies during those periods, Congress, the social life. And I actually do one tour downtown at Lafayette Square, which was Buffalo's old park. It's on the anti-slavery history of Buffalo. And in that park, Frederick Douglass spoke for the first time. You had Quincy Adams came there. He spoke in the park. Fillmore was in the park. You had a Free Soil Party. They had their tent there. The 1848 tents, they were in the park. The Liberty Party had their tent there. So it's something I came across about 15 years ago, and I thought, gee, nobody knows this in the area. So I put together this tour, and I worked through one of the through Explore Buffalo, which is a nonprofit that puts on tours. So that's the one tour I do. And anybody that takes it is stunned at the end. They say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know so much was going on." So that my interest feeds into there, and naturally, going into the presidency, Fillmore being part of the presidents from Buffalo, that he interests me because of his connection to that period also, and the conflict, the fact that an anti-slavery man can sign a fugitive slave law, and how are people thinking, but anyways, that period, anti-slavery, antebellum period, William Lloyd Garrison, I've read on him, and one guy I haven't read much on is Daniel Webster, but boy, he seems like an arrogant individual. I'm fascinated to pick up something on him sometime.
So Robert Remini has a book on him, and I would recommend that one.
Oh, Remini. Okay. I've read his Jackson books.
Oh, yes.
And I think he is a Quincy Adams. Yeah.
Yeah, he did all the major ones, and his Webster one is really good, really interesting.
I'll have to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and for our listeners, I hope that anybody who goes to the Buffalo area, go on a tour with John. As you can see, just in our conversation here, you're passionate about history. There's so much more to learn from you. And so I do encourage our listeners to take your tour, because that would be fascinating.
Yes. And please come to the center. We're open on Saturdays, 10 to 4. It's a volunteer organization. It's the only day we can get volunteers staffed on a continuous basis. In fact, I'm going down there later today. I'm meeting some guy, like you, that I only knew on email. He's a McKinley fan. So I'm going to learn about McKinley later. So it's great to get into the conversations. I mean, what fun. You must have a lot of fun talking about all the presidents. This is great.
Oh, absolutely. And John, I cannot thank you enough for joining me today to talk about presidential history. I love, I love the perspective. I love being able to talk with folks and just to see their passion about history, and for you likewise to share it with our listeners who are also passionate about presidential history. So thank you so much. And thank you for telling us more about the Buffalo Presidential Center.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for inviting our group onto it. And, I feel fortunate that I was able to come here today. It's always a joy to talk to somebody about the presidents. Even if we disagree, I'm in. I'm okay with it.
Hey, that's what it's all about.
Oh, that can make it fun. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much again to John Fagant of the Buffalo Presidential Center for joining me for this episode and this fascinating discussion about the role that Buffalo played in U.S. presidential history. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the Buffalo Presidential Center, including upcoming programs and how to visit, check out their website at buffalopresidentialcenter.org. I'll have a link to the Presidential Center's page on my website, which can be found at presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more information on all the American presidents, and ways that you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Speaking of, I'd like to say a special thank you to our newest patron, Bruce. Bruce has been a listener for a while and a great supporter, so I'm very honored that he decided to take his support to the next level. For as little as $1 a month, you can join Bruce and all of our patrons in helping to support the work of Presidencies. As a token of my appreciation, all patrons get access to an ad-free feed of the podcast, as well as special patron-exclusive episodes. We're currently going through a series on the Postmasters General prior to that office becoming a cabinet-level post. With the latest episode alone, you have political scandal, shady land deals, potential corruption, and more. Also, each level of support has an additional perk. Just check out patreon.com/presidencies if you'd like to become a patron. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach me via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on social media. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. I've also got a page on LinkedIn. Just search for Presidencies of the United States. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.